Global Warming by Nicholas Goldberger. So, in discussion of global warming, we're going to take a look at the first two most responsible compounds that cause global warming. First up, we have carbon dioxide, which reasoning behind this is because carbon dioxide is one of the largest pollutants in the atmosphere right now and takes up a large percentage of what causes global warming. Next up, we're going to look at the anthropogenic source, which is human-caused sources of carbon dioxide, which will be automobile emissions from burning fossil fuels. Basically, the way this works is that carbon dioxides are emitted from the exhaust of vehicles from the combustion-based engines and are released into the atmosphere from this through the fumes. Very simple process, but also highly effective at distributing carbon dioxide. Next, we'll have up the non-anthropogenic source, which are volcanoes, and non-anthropogenic means non-human related, so natural. So volcanoes are actually the largest producer of this naturally, and through giant plumes of smoke and what comes in soot and like other such pollutants, carbon dioxide is one of the largely produced pollutants from these giant plumes of smoke and ash, and are released into the atmosphere. Next up, as far as our second compound, we have nitrogen oxides, which are very similar to carbon dioxides in the sense that they have a lot of the same impacts, and although not as plentiful, their impact is still very great because their overall effect is multiplied from carbon dioxide. So the first source we have is anthropogenic, which is released through industrial farming, through the fertilizer, which are urea-based, which means they have very high nitrogen content. And basically, these nitrogen oxides are released as soon as these fertilizers are let loose upon the farmlands, which means there's a very high count of nitrogen oxides emitted. Next up, for the non-anthropogenic source, we have decomposition of organic matter. This could be anywhere from animal waste to animal remains. And we'll have decomposers like insects and fungi, which decompose this matter and from doing so release nitrogen oxides into the atmosphere, similarly to how they're released through fertilizer, except the matter has to be consumed in order to do so, which leads to be a slightly less effective process than the fertilizer. So next up, we're going to talk about where global warming actually occurs in the atmosphere, which obviously everyone knows it occurs in the atmosphere, as I just said. However, it's important to know that it occurs mainly in the troposphere, which is similar to where planes fly and is actually the lowest level. So the process, we're going to start with an emission of some sort. So we're going to take a look at automobiles again, where, fun fact, nitrogen oxides are emitted through fossil fuel burning as well. So we're going to have our carbon dioxides and our nitrogen oxides emitted from these exhaust fumes, and they're going to float up into the atmosphere, as said before. The next step we're going to have where the carbon dioxides and nitrogen dioxides gather in the atmosphere, and basically what this means is that they're floating around, but these things can last anywhere from hours to hundreds of years depending on the strength of it. So the next up, we have the process, which is very natural and happens every day, all the time. Sunlight and solar radiation hit the planet. Normally, about 70% of this passes through the atmosphere, and 30% is bounced back immediately through the upper layers. However, that 70% that passes through is normally absorbed by the land and oceans. So, in terms of this, it'll pass through the layers all the way to reach our surface, and again get absorbed by the land and oceans. And what this does is this will heat the planet naturally. However, this will become something negative, as we'll see in a moment. So once it passes through, nothing to the extent happens that is unnatural or harmful inherently. Where we have the next part about this, where it becomes harmful, is that we'll have the 90% of the sunlight and solar energy be radiated back from the surface to the atmosphere as infrared light. And what happens is these compounds will trap the infrared light, causing additional heating known as global warming. This in turn is also known as the greenhouse effect, where it causes additional heating. As more of these compounds reach the air, it causes more and more additional heating, which is unnatural. So next up, we're going to talk about the environmental consequences, and one that's very common but also very prevalent is the melting of icebergs, which in turn cause rising sea levels as a majority of the world's fresh water is held in these glaciers, and this is caused by the increasing temperatures. Next up, we're going to talk about the health consequences. Now, health consequences are a little tricky because it's kind of hard to pinpoint. However, increasing temperatures have led to increasing deaths and consequences from cardiovascular issues and lung and respiratory issues, as it makes it harder for people to breathe and other such consequences. Now, we're going to talk about prevention. The first step we have is very simple, however, very underused, which is the switching to clean energy that reduces emissions, such as solar and wind power, which reduces the emissions, therefore lessens the heating impact. Finally, we have a solution which is very uncommon, which is called greening, where iron particles are released into the water by ships and in turn break down and essentially cause these large algae blooms. And the thought process behind it is that these large algae blooms will cover a good portion of the ocean surface and absorb carbon dioxide. However, it may have consequences on the ecosystem. Thank you for listening. This was Global Warming by Nicholas Goldberger.